So I want to talk to you just a little bit about something we're supposed to be doing when we fill out a URAR. And I know you're filling it out. The question is, are you filling it out correctly? Are you putting items in the fields that you're supposed to be putting in there? So I want to have a conversation about that because I'm finding that some appraisers aren't actually putting the information that's asked of them in the proper fields of that form. And I know the forms are going to be changing pretty soon probably, but I just want a conversation. I just want to highlight a couple of things to make sure you're putting the correct data in the correct field, because I think this is a little confusing. It was certainly confusing for me, which is not that hard to confuse me. And I also want to tell you real quickly about a new word. It's not really a new word, but it became a new word for me, and some of my students have used it since I've passed that information on to them. So come on back and we'll talk about a new word and also make sure you're on track to fill out the URAR correctly. Are you sure that you're filling it out correctly? Well, I was sure until you asked me, are you sure? Come on back and let's make sure. Hi, this is Bryan. You're listening to the Appraisal Update Podcast, brought to you as always by Appraiser eLearning. We're glad you're here. We hope you are doing well. And I want to jump right into this. I do want to thank our sponsor, LIA Administrators and Insurance. Thank you very much for your support of the Appraisal Update Podcast. All right, let's dive in. The first thing I want to do is actually talk about the word. Some of you may be aware of it. Some of you might not. And quite frankly, I wasn't aware of it. I was in a class and we were talking about the form, and I had a student come up and said, Bryan, have you ever heard of the word rurban? And I said, excuse me? He said, have you ever heard the word rurban? And I said, no, I have not. You made that up. He said, no, I'm actually doing a review right now, and the appraisal report that I'm reviewing, the appraiser actually checked suburban and rural and called it a rurban, put those two words together. And I said, you made that up. And he said, I've got the report out in my car. Would you like to see it? And I said, I'd love to see it. So he went out and got it and brought it back in. And we were discussing, many years ago, appraisers were fearful of putting rural because a lot of lenders frowned on that or didn't want to lend in rural areas or charge more or scrutinized it more, or whatever the case may be. And so a lot of appraisers felt pressure. They want to keep their clients happy. They felt pressured to check suburban. And guys, you check whatever is applicable to your subject property. If it's in a rural setting, you say it's rural. If it's a one-bedroom home, you check that it's a one-bedroom home. You let your client know that. And that's another whole story. But I had someone call a one-bedroom home a two-bedroom home because their client didn't provide financing on one-bedroom homes. Guys, you don't manipulate it to keep your client happy. If it's a one-bedroom, it's a one-bedroom, period. And we'll go over that in another podcast or another broadcast. But sure enough, he brought that report in, and it had suburban checked, it had rural checked, and then below that, he said the subject property is situated in an urban area. And we laughed about it a little bit. And then below that, he had a definition for what urban meant. And I read it, and I'll tell you, it sounded pretty good. And so below that, he had an area that gave the source of that definition. Now, if you give a source for a definition, what can I do? Or what can any of us do? We can look it up. We can go to that same source and look it up and see if we can find it. I happened to call my buddy Clay, and he answered the phone. I said, Clay, I'm on break during this class. A student brought this up and said something about a report he's reviewing, and said the appraisers called it an urban area. Have you ever heard of that? He started laughing. You could hear him laughing on my phone. He said, no, I've never heard of that. I said, do you happen to have your dictionary of real estate appraisal handy? He said, it's on the corner of my desk. I said, well, I took off and left mine. Would you mind just looking in there and see? Well, he went and got his book and looked it up, and he said, Bryan, it's in there. I said, you're kidding. So let me read to you what he read to me, because the definition is the same after all these years. It hasn't changed yet. RURBAN, an area in transition from agricultural use to suburban residential and commercial development. An area with both rural and suburban characteristics that's within commuting distance of a city. I thought, wow, we've got all kinds of urban areas here where I live. And you probably do too. So in one of the classes that I have, I've got that illustrated up, and I'll just share that with you right now. You know, we talk about the URAR and those boxes, and so we talk about an urban area, we talk about a suburban area, and we certainly talk about a rural area. Those are your checkbox options on the URAR. And then you'll see I added this urban to my little list. And if you're listening to me, I'll fill you in. If you're not watching, you can certainly jump over to our YouTube channel and subscribe. And then all of our podcasts are now being videotaped as well. And it's really for this reason, not necessarily to see me, but to kind of, if we put up a visual, you can take a peek at it. And in a minute, I'm going to show you a reference to Fannie Mae. And so we're going to be using the video quite a bit. But for those of you not watching, you're driving your car or something and you're listening in, on the screen right now, I'm sharing a little snippet of the URAR, or at least a little piece of it. And it's the very first box. And this is what we're going to be talking about this whole podcast, is sections of this box. And actually, it's the second box. The first one's subject, excuse me. The second box is neighborhood, and in capital bold letters in the top left-hand side, it says neighborhood. Capital bold letters, neighborhood. If you're watching, you see that. I just zoomed in a little bit. And your checkbox options are urban, suburban, and rural, right? Urban, of, relating to, or consisting of an area which is chiefly residential, but where some farming is carried on. And I've actually got a blend of rural and urban. I've actually got a little illustration that I'm putting on the screen now. And it says, on the fringe of urban development that are in the process of being developed for urban uses. And so if you look at this little illustration I have, and again, for you listening, I'll describe it best I can. It's some circles, and the most center circle is your central business district, right in the very middle. And then right outside of that is a little bit larger circle, and it's classified as an urban area. And then you've got a circle that's a little wider and outside that urban area, and that's classified as a suburban area. And then way far outside of that, in all that white space, that would be a rural area. But then those little pockets there, and you can, if you're watching, you can see a little pocket right there, a little arrow to it. All of those are classified as urban areas. They're little pockets in between the suburban and rural areas. So I thought I'd just share that with you. Like I said, you probably have some urban areas in your community, and I've used that, and I've had students use that. Now, the first time, so thank you to whoever that person is that used that. You educated my student, you actually educated me, the instructor. So I love it when the instructor learns stuff. I love learning new things because I get excited about it and I want to share it with you, right? So I share this quite often, and I had a student call me up one time. He said, "Now, I don't think you could check both boxes, but you certainly can make a statement, right? And you can make a illustration. You can have that illustration if you want it. If you want it, just email me. I'll be happy to email it to you." But I had somebody call me one time. He said, "Bryan, I tried that Reuben thing. I thought it was highly appropriate. I wanted to use it. I put it in my report, and the underwriter didn't take it." And I said, "Well, did you include a definition as to what Reuben means? And did you put a source for the definition?" "No, I didn't do any of that." And I said, "Well, they probably thought you made it up." Just like I thought this appraiser made it up. You really need to put your definition and your source for that definition. It adds credibility, and then the reviewer or underwriter can look it up just like I did. I was very doubtful. I was very suspicious. I didn't believe it. But when I saw that definition and it sounded pretty good, then I saw for the source of the definition, and it really lent to credibility. But I still wasn't 100% convinced. So I went to that source and looked it up, and I'm a believer now. It's in there. It is a word, and it's an appropriate word in many instances. So I had another appraiser, Chip. Chip is what he goes by, Chip Rowe. If you're listening, Chip, hello. Chip has said that he has used this many times. He's in the Nashville market. Chip has taken many of my classes over the years, and he was just in a virtual class not long ago that Appraiser eLearning was offering. So Chip says he's used this many times, but he does put a definition, does put a source. So let's focus on another part of this form for just a second. And I'm going to go back to my little screenshot. If you're, again, listening, I'll just describe it. So I am back to that little snippet of the URAR, right? And the area that most of this is pretty self-explanatory, but I want to really zone in for just a second on this one unit housing trends. Because while in capital bold letters on the left-hand margin says neighborhood, and you would think that means everything in there is for the neighborhood, like the universe of properties in the neighborhood. That's not true with this one unit housing trend. Fannie Mae wants you to do something different in that box. And that's why I want you to be very aware of this. Now, if you say, well, all the properties in the neighborhood compete with the same properties in the neighborhood, then that's fine. But how often does that happen? Every house in the neighborhood is in a competitive state for the same buyers as your subject? It's not very common, at least not in my markets. I mean, there might be some exceptions where all the houses compete, but normally you have what we call a unit mix. You have some smaller houses, you have some bigger houses, et cetera, et cetera. You have higher priced homes, and you have some that aren't as high. And typically someone looking at the smaller house, which is probably the lower price home, wouldn't be able to afford the bigger houses, which are higher priced, right? Scarcity, utility, desire, and purchasing power are the four economic influences that create value. Those have to be in balance. And somebody probably looking for a bigger house that can afford that bigger house probably wouldn't consider one of the smaller houses as a substitute. Why? Well, because they have purchasing power, transferability, that's fine. Because there's scarcity, that's fine. But it probably doesn't meet their utility, and they probably don't desire it. If you're looking for a bigger home, I need 4 or 5 bedrooms. Would you consider a 2-bedroom as a substitute property? Probably not. Okay, so I wanted to zone in on this housing trend for a minute. And what I want to do is I want to take you to the authoritative source. So many people get in conversations, they get into fights or arguments. Fannie Mae requires this. No, they don't. They require this. And FHA requires this. No, they don't. Yes, they do. Well, USPAP says you can't do that. No, it doesn't say that. Yes, it does. Go to the authoritative source. And sometimes maybe you can't find the answer there, but the majority of the time you can. If it's a USPAP issue, go to USPAP. If it's a Fannie Mae issue, pull up the Fannie Mae guidelines. If it's a FHA protocol, you can find FHA policy at HUD.gov. I went over that in one of the most recent podcasts. All right. So this time we're going to go to Fannie Mae to look for some guidance in how do they want us to fill out this one unit housing trends. So I'm going to pull up the Fannie Mae website in 1 second. But first, I want to say, since 1978, LIA Administrators and Insurance has been offering E&O insurance to valuation professionals just like you. LIA applies superior customer service, exceptional liability, education, and unparalleled claim defense to serve over 10,000 real estate professionals nationwide. They offer a whole host of policies. Come find the right one for you by visiting liability.com to learn more about LIA. Again, thank you very much, LIA, for your sponsorship of the Appraisal Update and podcast. We certainly appreciate that. Now, let's look over at the Fannie Mae website. Here we go. So, if we look right here, let me go back 1 second, guys. I am sorry. I am trying to do my best. All right, let's try this again. So here we go. Nope, here we go. I have too many buttons to push, Hal. So this is the Fannie Mae website. You can see up here in the top, it says simply fanniemae.com, right? Now, if you want to put the www in, you can. But fanniemae.com takes you to this primary website. And so from this point, there's a tab at the top called Business Partners. And if you just hover over that, Single Family Business appears. So I'm going to click on that. It changes the page. And where do you think we find the appraisal stuff? So Fannie Mae publishes 2 guides. They used to be able to print them out or get them by print. Actually, they'd mail them to you. They were great big, they big books in a big spiral binder. One is called a servicing guide, and that's for loan servicing purposes. Fannie Mae doesn't service their own loans. They have servicing entities that service the loan. And then the other guide is called the selling guide. And if you're doing appraisal work for purchases or refinances, so what's happening is the lender is making that loan, and then they're going to package that loan, and they're going to sell a pool of those loans to Fannie Mae. So the selling guide incorporates everything you have to do from the time you take the loan application upon delivering the loan to Fannie Mae. Well, guess what? The appraisal is part of that process, isn't it? So if you look at the screen, the appraisal takes place during the origination phase. So we're going to click on origination and underwriting. And from there, I'm going to click the selling guide. You see right here over on the right-hand side, there is an option that says selling guide. We want the selling guide, so I'm going to click on that. And the selling guide, you see, has a table of contents, Part A, Part B, Part C, Part D, Part E. We want Part B because Part B deals with origination through closing. And again, the appraisal is part of the origination process as far as the underwriter, the lender goes. So now we're in Part B, and in particular, here's the loan package application, eligibility, underwriting the property, unique eligibility. Underwriting the property. That's what we want. That's where you're going to find appraisal stuff. So from this part, there's a whole bunch of stuff here, and I encourage you to get to know Chapter B4. B4, here's unacceptable appraisal practice. Probably ought to take a minute to look at that. There's a lot of stuff here. What we're talking about today in this podcast is the neighborhood section, right? So I am going to the neighborhood section. For my listeners, it's B4-1.3-03. That's where I'm at. That's the reference, right? In the selling guide of fanniemae.com, B4-1.3-03, neighborhood section of the appraisal report. And so as I come down, we're talking about trends. I told you that's the one block that they want something a little different, and I want to make sure you're adhering to. So if we come down here, this is what I want. And let's just look at this real quickly. I'm reading this right from Fannie Mae guideline. When completing the one unit housing trends portion of the neighborhood section on the appraisal report forms, the trends must be reflective of those properties deemed to be competitive to the property being appraised. Did you hear that? Deemed to be competitive. So not the universe of sales, not the universe of listings, but those that are in competitive nature with your subject property. Properties deemed to be competitive to the property being appraised. If the neighborhood contains properties that are truly competitive, that is, market participants make no distinction between the property, then all the properties within the neighborhood would be reflected in the one unit housing trend section. So again, in that situation, you're saying every house in this neighborhood competes for the same buyer as every other house in this neighborhood. I think that rarely it can happen. I believe it certainly does happen, but I think that's the rarity. I think typically you have segments within the neighborhood that are in a competitive state, but other segments that aren't. However, when a segmented or bifurcated market is present, the one unit housing trend portions must reflect those properties from the same segment of the market as the property being appraised. This ensures that the analysis being performed is based on competitive properties. For example, if a neighborhood contains a mix of property types not considered competitive by market participants, then a segmented or bifurcated market is present. The appraiser should also provide commentary on the other segment or segments of the neighborhood when segmentation is present. So they do ultimately want to know the neighborhood or what's going on with other properties, but they're mostly concerned. I mean, it says right here, they have to be competitive. Properties deemed to be competitive with the property being appraised. So when you're filling out that one unit housing trends, you're using competing properties within the same market area or neighborhood. So be real careful there. We see that appraisers are just using the universe completely, all the properties in the neighborhood. And I understand that. I mean, I honestly think that's what we should be doing, but we should be reporting on the competitive properties as well. To me, best practices would mean in a section of a pre-printed form that says neighborhood in capital bold letters, then we ought to be reporting what's going on in the neighborhood as a whole. And I understand that the banker or lender is not making a loan on the neighborhood. I get it. The banker or lender is making a loan on the subject property. So it certainly makes sense that they are very interested in knowing what's going on with alike properties that compete for the same buyers as the subject. That perfectly makes sense to me. But that should probably be somewhere else. Maybe you ought to have another little section, or take the capital bold letters that say neighborhood off of that, or put one unit housing trends in a section that says subject and competing properties. How are they behaving? To me, best practices would be any section that says neighborhood reflects what's going on in the neighborhood as a whole. And then somewhere else we could talk about the subject property and alike properties. And I understand this is important. It's great information. I think it's a little naive to think that all properties are doing the same thing at the same time. You may have a neighborhood that overall is in a state of decline, but the subject property and alike properties may be stable or may be increasing. Maybe everybody's selling the big houses and moving out of them, and they're downsizing to get the smaller, cheaper houses, right? And so in that scenario, you would have some in a state of decline, while at the exact same time in the exact same market area, you would have some increasing. Anyway, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to point this out to you and make sure you take a really, really close look make sure if you have properties in a neighborhood that aren't all competing for the same buyers, that in the section of one unit housing trends, in the neighborhood section of the URAR, you are reporting properties that are truly competing for the same buyers as the subject property. That's what Fannie Mae wants you to do. We just read it. We just had it on the screen. FannieMae.com. Go to the selling guide. Go to B4. You'll find it. You can read it yourself. I hope you're doing very well. I hope you're staying safe. I hope you're making some money. I hope business is picking up a little bit. I'm optimistic. I think business is going to start to pick up a little bit, right? Just hang on there. And again, think about doing some other things. We're certainly doing that in my practice. We're looking at other avenues and other things to do. We're still doing, I looked at 3 properties today, and I took a little video because Kelsey got her feet muddy and she tried to rinse them off in the driveway. So maybe Appraiser eLearning will put that up somewhere and you get a laugh out of that. Anyway, thank you very much for listening or watching on our YouTube. Please be safe. Thank you, LIA, for your sponsorship of the Appraisal Update and Podcast. Until next time, folks, I'm Bryan Reynolds, your host. Happy appraising.
The Appraisal Update Podcast is brought to you by Appraiser eLearning.